Hi, everybody. Welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Graven, and my guest today, joining us from Singapore, is Nick Jonsson. He is the co-founder and managing director of one of Asia's premier networking organizations. It's called the Executives Global Network, or EGN Singapore. It's a caring peer group community that provides hundreds of executives a safe haven to share their challenges, receive support, and learn from each other. So before I tell you a little bit more about Nick, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you so much, Mark, for inviting me. I'm great, thank you.
I love the description of your group because I want the podcast here today to be likewise a safe haven. The safe haven is a mistake in trying to pronounce a word there. A safe haven for mispronunciation. How's that? It's a safe haven, more importantly, for you to share, as I know you're going to be doing today, talking about challenges. And so thank you for being here. So Nick has a passion for mental health awareness that comes through his lived life experiences. I think we're going to be hearing about that today. It paved the way for Nick to write his first book, #1 international best-selling book that was published in April 2021. It's titled Executive Loneliness: The 5 Pathways to Overcoming Isolation, Stress, Anxiety, and Depression in the Modern Business World. So in addition to the book, Nick's created an online community where executives and business leaders can connect and learn, reduce the risk of burnout and isolation. You can find that at www.leaders-anonymous.com. And Nick's website, and there'll be links in the show notes to all of this, is nickjonsson.com, a proper Swedish spelling of Johnson or Jonsson, we could say, right?
That's right, Mark. And actually, I lived in Australia, Asia, and UK, and everyone pronounced Johnson differently. The most common have been to just say Johnson. Even in Sweden, we say Jonsson.
Nick, I asked Nick, he was pretty easygoing about pronunciation of the name, as long as, we'll move on to more important things, and I think a very important topic today, an important story. So with me stumbling through my attempts at welcomes and introductions, Nick, we'll move past that. Looking back at your work and your life, what would you say is your favorite mistake?
Well, being Swedes, we are not really known for being sociable people and talking too much, and when the pandemic came, people were still not even social distancing more. We always did. We were quite distant. So I grew up never speaking really about my emotions and feelings. I didn't do that with my parents, with my family. And this has led me to always keeping also my emotions inside me. I did that as I grew up as a leader and in my workplace. So that was my favorite mistake today, looking back at that and looking how brutally difficult it was to be leading organizations when you're not talking about how you're feeling inside.
So I'm thank you for sharing that, and I'm curious, to hear some more detail of that. Of like, as a leader, working as an executive, when you talk about hiding or keeping emotions or not sharing at the time what you were going through, what were you going through as a successful executive that people didn't know about?
Well, I was working in mainly Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand as an executive, and sometimes in a big company with more than 1,000 staff. And then being a foreigner in this country, you cannot speak the local language, you don't understand the legal system, the culture, and everything else, and you're trying to lead the people. So of course you have a lot of challenges, but you have that in any leadership positions. You have a lot of challenges, and with that comes a lot of feelings, and you need to have a way to address the feelings. And what I learned later on is that the natural is to have someone to talk about it and not covering it by yourself and just trying to soldier on and push through. So that pain was just so big in Mark. And I can recall thinking back that this started in my childhood, that you had these feelings, but because I didn't have a way to talk about them in my childhood, I didn't know. Therefore, I didn't talk to anyone in my adulthood either.
And so what prompted you to start sharing more of your story and what you had been struggling with?
Well, I had to be brought on my knees for that to happen, Mark. I kept it so much inside me that it actually led me to resign from a big position, and it led to my divorce with my ex-wife, because also I didn't talk to anyone about the challenges we had there. It led to me to move from country, and I isolated myself completely. And this was something that not even my parents knew about. My close friends didn't know about. I didn't talk to anyone about it. So it had to be almost that I was actually brought to my knees. I was hospitalized. I had fallen into alcohol addiction. And that's how bad things had to go before I actually surrendered. And I had to burst everything in one go. And when I started to tell it to doctors and psychologists, and also in a mental health related recovery program.
Mm-hmm. And beyond, so fine, that hitting a point to ask for help, and I think that seems like such an important, it sounds like such a simple step, but so many adults are afraid to ask for help on matters that are small, or I think as you were dealing with issues that were really, really serious, important issues. I'm curious if you tell us just a little bit more about kind of that point where you decided to reach out for help, and what helped bring that to be.
Yes, so actually in that stage when I was so sick, and it was actually in Indonesia, and it's going back to 2015 this year, I knew that I couldn't also get much help locally in Indonesia. There was not enough English-speaking psychologists, and the help wasn't there. The organizations I looked up on Google, the anonymous support organizations and so on, were not really operating there. So I knew I had to go back to a Western country. I started to look at the US, UK, Australia, or Singapore. And because I was in Asia, Singapore looked okay. So I was pleased to eventually land a job opportunity in Singapore, and knowing that there I should be able to get help. And when I started to go and see doctors, and I got blood tests, and they saw me, I was in a very, very bad shape. And at this stage, Mark, I had turned into a daily drinker. I was basically drinking alcohol to depress my feelings, and I had gained a lot of weight, and I was not a pretty sight in any way.
And reaching out to help, reaching out for help. How difficult was that process of getting things turned around and going in a more positive direction?
The most difficult thing was just to get started, as most things in life, Mark. As soon as I just had made a first effort, of course, the doctor was showing sympathy and showing me the result. Yes, I got scared, but someone listened to me. At this stage, I had met the new woman who today is my wife, and I started to tell her how I felt. And immediately after, I started just telling her. She showed sympathy. She came with me to the doctor. She came with me to my first support group meeting, even though she didn't come in, but she came to me there and made sure it happened. And it went very, very quickly. Just after about a week or 2 weeks of having actually shared my problem and discussed it, I was already better. And that was, it was like a complete U-turn, basically.
And so then, back to the workplace setting. A lot of times people are afraid to ask for help at work. They're afraid to be vulnerable. We want to keep up, this facade of invincibility or success. Was there a point where you started sharing what you were going through with people at work?
Yes, it was, Mark, but it took a while. I was actually about 1.5 years into my recovery. And let's call it this way. At the first 1.5 years of my recovery, it was between my wife, myself, my doctors, my psychologist, and my anonymous support group. And that's the space I was comfortable sharing my challenges. My parents had at this stage also found out about it, but not to the full extent. But then in 2019, so I came into recovery in 2018. In 2019, a colleague and friend of mine in Singapore died of suicide. And this was a Western guy, an expat, and no one of us had any idea what was going on in his life. He had just come back from the base camp in Mount Everest, which was one of the dreams of his life. He shared on Facebook that he was never happy in his life. He had a girlfriend he loved, and it came to a shock to all of us. And that was the day, Mark, when I decided to go actually global with my story. I immediately set up a fund to raise money about suicide awareness. I became a volunteer for SOS, as a suicide prevention agency in Singapore. And I made a LinkedIn post about my friend's death. And for the very reason that I realized that I could have gone down this path unless I decided to speak up. So that was the game changer. And that post I made on LinkedIn, and that the fund I started to raise money for went viral. And I was contacted from people all over the world. And before I knew it, I was live on radio talking about this, and there was no turning back.
It's awful to hear, about your loss. To try to turn what happened and what you went through into something positive for others, I think is very admirable. So I appreciate you, you sharing your story in different ways with us, Nick. And I'm curious, how much then, as you've continued working to help others and writing the book, how much does all of that help with your own continued healing and growth?
It's a huge part of my recovery, Mark. And the reason for writing the book was it started already there when I went on radio, and the questions I was asked on radio. And then before I knew it, then it was in the local newspaper. They wrote a 4 pages feature about me in the local business newspaper here in Singapore. And as far as I know, it's the biggest mental health related piece ever written in the history in Singapore. So, and all these coverages, all these questions went through my head, and I realized there's no one talking about this over here. So that's why I decided to take it to the next step. And because I had so much coverage and so many ideas around it, I put together a survey, which I took out to the community and surveyed senior executives. And then that led me to interviews. And before I knew it, that I had all this material for this book. So publishing it was natural to me, because as I had made a promise to my friend who passed away, his family, that I was going to shout out this message loud. And what is a better way than writing a book in his memory? So that's what I did, and that was my way then of overcoming this, Mark. And for every time, and thanking you also today for inviting me to talk about this. You are helping me to recover, because I'm going through this again, and it is emotional, but it's positive emotional these days. And so speaking about this for me is the best thing that ever happened.
And if the listener is feeling like they need help, or they're struggling with any of these feelings, we certainly hope people can reach out to mental health professionals or to family, or to suicide prevention hotlines. There are resources. And people, whether they know you or whether they're strangers, there are people who care about you and want to help. And so thank you, Nick, for your caring and willingness to help others. Because I think sometimes people might feel very alone in feelings of depression. They may feel ashamed to bring it up. So I appreciate you having the strength to talk about what you had gone through. And so to that point, I mean, there's kind of a common cliche people will say about executives, it's lonely at the top. There must be some truth in that, but I'm curious, from what you've experienced and what you've learned talking to others, Nick, what you frame in the book title as executive loneliness. How might that be different than everyday loneliness that anybody who's not an executive at any point How is that executive loneliness different? Or
Well, basically, you're right, Mark. It is lonely at the top indeed. And the higher up you go up this hierarchy, there's less people at your level you can speak with. If you're, let's say, working in an office with 1,000 people and you are a middle manager, you might have 100 or 200 people in different departments or across the organization who have a similar level of responsibility, same size of team, perhaps 5-7 employees in the team who they manage, for example, and the challenges they have might be quite similar. So they can go for a coffee break and they can talk about it and do some sharings around that. If you are the top leader of the organization, you probably don't have anyone in your office with the same kind of responsibility. You have to go outside the organization to find those people if you have the time and if you know how to do that. But in that sense, you are also paid and expected to be the one who can make the big decision, who can handle the heat. And that is where the challenges lies. And if you then don't have your support network outside the organization or somewhere, a coach, mentor, or perhaps a peer network or whatever it may be, as a resource for you, then that can be a very, very lonely place. And that is exactly, Mark, what happened to me. I was running an office with 1,400 people in a country where I wasn't born, in the medical industry, and I didn't talk to someone about these problems. I kept them inside me, and that is exactly what too many executives are doing.
And so it seems like there's that loneliness, but then there's maybe another level of loneliness, of feeling alone in the loneliness. And that's where it seems like the group, the Executives Global Network, is meant to provide kind of a forum for people to come together in that way.
Yes, and you have many of these organizations in the US as well. Most often they're called confidential peer networks or peer groups, and they are exactly for this reason. And they are, of course, a proactive measure instead of a reactive recovery. It shouldn't have to go as far as it did in my case. You should be able to build up this before. You should perhaps have, a coach who you can work with. You should have your mentor outside the organization. You should have your group. If you have all these in place before you're going into these senior roles as you're progressing, then if you do stumble and fall and make mistakes, then you have someone to discuss with it, and you can come back and address it right away before it turns into a deadly mistake, which it almost was in my case, and as it was in my friend that sadly passed.
Yeah. It seems like it might be a particular challenge with executives who have been successful. They have believed in themselves and their abilities to do things and to face challenges. It seems like it might be a challenge to get somebody then to be willing to reach out for help before they hit a point of, you might call it rock bottom. What are your experiences?
I actually, in my book, I call it a smiling depression. And what I mean with a smiling depression, and we see it among celebrities also, we see it among famous people, because they need to keep the facade together. You can see them busting through, and then many of the artists or movie actresses and so on, that they make mistakes when it's just the pressure is too much, and that is similar for senior executives, that they're hiding behind this smile, behind this beautiful facade, but not everything is what you expect it to be behind there. And when I talk to psychologists and therapists who I interviewed for my book, they say that of senior executives, many of them are very insecure, to the point where we call them insecure overachievers is another label. And many are actually achieving so much because they have this inner insecurity that they have to constantly prove themselves and perform well to feel good themselves.
Yeah, that's an interesting dynamic, and then that drive could lead someone to say at various points of recognizing that they're not feeling well, but I can do this. I can power through it. I mean, that seems like that might be a common thought that would hold people back from asking for help.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we haven't been trained to deal with the small challenges in our life, to discuss them openly or ask for help, then when we're found with the big ones, we're definitely not going to share that.
Yeah. And I remember I did a podcast in a different series with a psychologist from UCLA. Bob Moorer is his name. And he wrote a book about Mastering Fear was the title of the book. And there can be fear as adults. We can have fear of all sorts of things. And there can be a fear of, fear around asking for help. And I remember one of the key insights he shared was that when children are scared, it is a natural reaction to ask for help. They might ask their parents, they might ask a teacher, they might ask another relative. And then at some point, whether it's through education or societal pressures, by the time we reach adulthood, unfortunately, it may be viewed as a sign of weakness to be asking for help. And I think Bob Moore has tried to encourage people to remember it is both perfectly normal and extremely helpful, even just to make a statement, that says, I'm scared. And I know adults find that uncomfortable. Curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, Mark, absolutely. That makes sense to me. And what we are taught in the recovery program is that if we cannot think of a person to take and ask for help, then ask a power greater than yourself for help, and in the terms of a prayer. And it doesn't have to involve religion. It's just to believe that there's something bigger there, because many leaders are also atheists, so it's difficult if you start to involve religion. But if we can believe as a leader that we are not the center of the universe, that we are not running the whole universe, if we can just accept that, then at least we can hand this over to some power which is bigger than ourselves. And that's a big starting point, but it's a major milestone for a leader which many times have a big ego.
I'm curious, Nick, to hear your thoughts about the last 2 years and COVID times of varying degrees of working from home, spending a lot of time on Zoom. Even though on one level that might seem like connection, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about what the last 2 years have done in terms of, is there increased loneliness at a deeper level?
Well, I did a survey then in 2019 of the executives in Singapore, where I asked them if they have ever suffered from loneliness or currently are. 30% answered yes. I did the same survey in December 2020, and the numbers had doubled to 59%.
Wow.
So indeed, 1 year into the pandemic, they were suffering more than before. So I think that paints a picture, because many of them had been in lockdowns, isolated. So indeed, it was more challenging. But I should say also, Mark, that not everyone is reacting in the same way. There's actually what I found when I dig deeper. People have gone into two camps. People who perhaps have faced a lot of challenges in their lives before have been striving through the pandemic because they saw it as not such a challenging thing. But people perhaps who were striving before the pandemic and who have not faced any challenges in their life in recent years, they, I have seen, have been struggling more than others. So that's one reflection that I shared with a few people, and they also see that.
Yeah. One thought, or another question that comes to mind here. I don't know if you've taken a look at, or if there's research that looks at the difference in people who would describe themselves as introverts versus extroverts. So a lot of times people think leaders must be extroverts, but there are many executives who would fit the definition of introvert, meaning that they draw energy from time alone, where extroverts draw energy from other people. I'm trying to even think through which group or is one of those two groups, and I realize it's a spectrum of introvert, extrovert, but differences in terms of people's susceptibility to feelings of loneliness based on that trait, do you know?
Yes, definitely, Mark. And I've been looking into this as well, because I'm an introvert myself. And what I found in the recovery program is that many addicts are actually also introverts, and they perhaps find it most comfortable to isolate themselves. But what I have learned about the introverts is just because we are most comfortable to isolate ourselves, it doesn't mean it's best for us. I have to be very disciplined myself to book a coffee meeting or a lunch meeting every day if I can. So I force myself outside of my bubble, my comfortable bubble, to actually meet people and do that face to face. So as soon as after the lockdowns, that was a very important thing for me personally. But I've seen it in the recovery program. The people who've been struggling are the ones who keep isolating themselves, who still, and I know people still today, 2 years now down the line, who are still isolating themselves, and they are not in a very good space at all.
Yeah. So Nick, you mentioned maybe a Swedish, what you described as a Swedish cultural tendency to keep things inside yourself. Americans, I mean, as much as you can generalize, maybe Americans have a tendency to overshare at times. I'm curious, as you've lived in different countries and maybe looked at aspects of this across cultures, are there certain countries where the executive loneliness problem tends to be more common or less effectively recognized?
Yeah, well, I think oversharing is probably better than undersharing, I would say. But yes, in Sweden, we didn't speak much about our feelings as I grew up. And also in Asia, it's the culture that you keep it inside the family. And you might be surprised to hear that even suicide attempts was only decriminalized in Singapore in 2019. So before that, if you had an incident in your family, perhaps a child who was going through suicidal thoughts, you wouldn't report it because it would be seen as a crime. So that's how young the conversation discussing suicide or mental health related matters are here in Asia. It's very closed, and that's why I'm now working as a volunteer on the grassroots level to try to break through this, that it is okay to talk about these conversations. So it's very close society here in Singapore as well.
And before we wrap up, I mean, I think it would be good to hear more about or reiterate some of the advice that you've shared, Nick. If if the listener feels like they're experiencing loneliness, whether we call it executive loneliness or not, or if you feel like a friend or a family member might be having some of those feelings of loneliness, what would you recommend? You've touched on this a little bit, but what would you recommend as some next steps that, or what's a good first step, realizing that first step can be difficult?
Yeah, Mark, the first step, actually, in my book, I have written 5 steps of recommendation. And the first step is what I call taking stock. And if we think about it, as a shop owner, for example, they would always do an inventory check once or twice a year. I say the first thing to do is sit down by yourself or with a coach or with a friend or a partner or a sponsor if you're in a mental health program, and take out a pen and paper or a spreadsheet and do an honest inventory on yourself. That's the first step. In my case, I had gained weight, I had stopped exercise, I was at this stage addicted to alcohol. There was also relationships that were broken, and I've brought all down these steps. So that was the first part. And then the second step is, who do I take these issues to? This to a doctor, this to an anonymous support group, this needs a psychologist, this needs my friend who goes on a jog every morning. You just look at it like in that should get you going.
Yeah. And I hope people will check out the book and learn more about the stories and the research and the tips and recommendations. I think one other question, back to the idea of if we, let's say we have this gut feeling of somebody in our life, we're like, well, something seems different, something seems not right, I'm not sure exactly what it is. Are there particular signs that you would look for? Is it important to try to understand what they might be going through as executive loneliness, or is it just more important to recognize, hey, something you I don't know. How do you approach somebody here? Let me reframe it in a different way. What would you recommend? How to approach somebody where you might sense something is not right, that might be uncomfortable to even try to bring up, even if it's a loved one or someone close to you?
Yes, and you have to be quite careful in this instance because people get very defensive, offended, and they might even close and escape more from you. So the best way, according to me, is to not face them in the eyes, especially men. Go for a walk, go for a run, drive in the car together, do some kind of activity. My favorite activity is cycling. If I can get the friend out for cycling, and don't ask them, share something about yourself. If you think that perhaps they have some issue, be vulnerable first and open up a little bit about what happened in your life. So, for example, if I know that one of my associate friends is going through perhaps a divorce, or I heard something about that, I will not ask him about that. I will try to go for a walk or something with this person, and I will lead into that topic and say that I went through a divorce a few years ago and so on, and share, be vulnerable first, and then the other person will most likely open up if they are ready.
Well, I think that's really good advice, and that's a good reminder of, I think trying to lead by example, whether you're leader of an organization or leading by example with a friend or a colleague, of showing that vulnerability, whether it's admitting that you're struggling with something or admitting that you've made a mistake. I think either way, that showing that vulnerability helps someone else realize, even if they're not ready to talk about it yet, that they're not alone, right?
Yeah, and the worst would be if you go straight into the office and look them in the eyes and ask them about it. That is not the way to do it.
Yeah. So that indirect, less threatening approach, that sounds like great advice of, like you said, not being directly face to face in a way that might be intimidating in terms of that topic. But maybe, a final question about executive loneliness. What are some of the signs that somebody might recognize in themselves or in somebody else to say that, this is a particular thing they're struggling with?
Well, if, for example, if you have a partner and they have a habit of, let's say they've been cooking Mexican dinner every Wednesday for a few years and suddenly they stop that, or if your life partner been playing the guitar 3 times a week, they stop, or in my instance, I was exercising a lot. Suddenly I stopped. I didn't go for my jogs. I had no interest in going for jogging anymore. It just completely stopped. Those are the signs to look out for. Or perhaps a mother who's losing interest in the child. If we see those patterns, then that's a signal that something is just not right.
Well, that seems like great advice. And, as you shared earlier, people can reach out and look for confidential peer networks, and to make sure that I have the connection straight between all of this. Is the Executives Global Network one and the same as the Leaders Anonymous network, or are those two separate?
Those are two separate. So
Okay.
Executive Global Network is an organization that I work with now, and they are in 15 countries, and you have many of these networks also in the US. The Leaders Anonymous is my platform, which I set up as a community related to my book.
Okay, and I think earlier I may have mistakenly, here's another mistake. I think I may have sort of combined the two in what I was thinking and what I was saying. So thank you for clarifying that those are two different, two different resources for people, and people might be able to go find their own local resources. So again, our guest today has been Nick Jonsson. Title of his book, again, is Executive Loneliness: The 5 Pathways to Overcoming Isolation, Stress, Anxiety, and Depression in the Modern Business World. So Nick, again, I'm thankful that you would be willing to share your story. I know that helps others, and really, really thankful that you were here with us today.
Thank you so much, Mark, for covering this important topic.